You know the feeling when the world shrinks to the few feet of light around you? When night swallows everything beyond the glow of a lamp or a dashboard, and the rest of the road becomes rumor. That is where these stories live. At the edge of light, in the thin air of night shifts, where people who barely see each other in daylight notice things most would call impossible. Before we start, stay with me until the end. Subscribe if you want more like this. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If you've ever worked nights, or you have a story that won't leave you, leave it below. Now, listen. My name is Ricardo Hernandez Morales. I worked the toll booth on the Toluca bypass for 7 years, nights from 10 until 6. The booth is a small box of breath and fluorescent light perched over black asphalt. In the winter, the fog sits low like rented smoke. In the summer, heat waves bend the paint on the road until it looks like a lake. I like the night work. The traffic is predictable, truckers nod. There is always a thermos of coffee, some radio, and the soft click of coins. You get used to the rhythm. You learn the faces of the late drivers. They become landmarks. That night, the fog came in heavy, as if the mountain itself had leaned over the highway to listen. It was 11:45. The toll sign's light buzzed above me, and my breath fogged the glass when I leaned out to take a coin. A car rolled up, slow, headlights faint through the mist. It wasn't a car I knew. The driver window was down, but there was no driver. There was a girl walking alongside the car. White dress, hair wet, bare feet on the cold shoulder. She looked younger than me at first glance. She looked small enough that I thought maybe she was a hitchhiker or someone who'd climbed out. "Hey," I called, automatic, the way you call to someone across a parking lot. "Do you need?" She didn't respond. She didn't look at me. She walked up to my booth and stood looking past the dim neon into the dark road like she was listening for something I couldn't hear. Her dress picked up a sheen from the fog. Under the booth light, it was almost luminous. The truckers behind the car leaned on their horns, annoyed. The car's engine idled. The driver still wasn't there. I stepped out because you step out for things like that. People fall asleep on the wheel. People walk in accidents. The asphalt was slick. Each step made a hissing sound. Up close, she smelled like rain and old flowers. She had a boy's backpack slung over one arm. When she turned, I saw how young she was, about 16, no more. Her eyes were glassy, not empty, but not fully here. "Where's the driver?" I asked, voice steady. I kept my hand on the coin tray, like a small ritual. She tilted her head. Her mouth moved. No sound came out. Then, very slowly, she lifted one hand and pointed down the highway, where the fog made a low white wall. It was the kind of gesture that meant hurry or leave or follow, an urgent, patient pointing that had no direction I recognized. I radioed the desk, told them there was a car stopped, that someone had walked out of it. They told me to keep an eye and to try to get the plate. The truckers behind me shouted that the car was empty, that the driver must have fallen asleep, that this stretch is bad for animals. I went to the car to check. The driver's door was open. There was a child's crumpled scarf on the seat, coffee cup, a phone, no driver. When I looked back, the girl was gone. No footprints in the slick asphalt, no drag marks. The fog kept moving like slow water. For the rest of the night, I thought of ordinary reasons. Someone had helped her, a relative had come back. She was frightened and I missed it. But the truth sits differently. At 3 in the morning, a patrol car came by, and the driver there made a slow, flat face. He said a small sedan had gone off the road 20 kilometers up, that it had hit a guardrail and flipped. He said the guardrail took the brunt at the passenger side. He said one passenger walked away from the crash and into the fog. He didn't say much more. Nobody did. I checked the morning paper because I always check the morning paper. There was a short column about a fatal accident on the bypass. The name in the print stopped my stomach. Andrea Morales, 16. A list of survivors. Her father's name, Emilio Morales. The photo was a school portrait. Smile so bright it made you feel guilty. White blouse, braid over her shoulder. The car in the picture wasn't the car I saw, but the day and the place lined up. I remember the funeral. I remember the way the town showed up, because in a small place you can't hide. People lined the road, and the priest said some words about God and rest, and I kept thinking about that girl's pointing hand. I saw Don Emilio once, a week after, at the side of the road where they'd put flowers. He had his coat buttoned up tight against the winter, head bowed. He looked older than his photograph in the obituary. I wanted to say something, anything, but the part of me that works night jobs knows the language of grief. I gave him his space. He picked up a single toy, dusted it with his fingers, and left it. Weeks later, there was another night, same fog, same booth. The thermos was empty, and I had the radio low. At 2 in the morning, a car rolled by slow as syrup. This time, a man stopped. He walked up to the booth and tapped. He was wearing the same coat as the man I'd seen by the flowers. He didn't look like he wanted to cause trouble. He looked like he had tried to put his life together and found he couldn't. "You the man at the toll?" he asked. "Ricardo," I said. "Don Emilio," he said. He said it like a name I should recognize, which I did, from the funeral list. He stared past me for a long time, like the night was pointing things out to him. "I used to pass this way with Andrea," he said. He had the look of someone who had finally allowed himself to cry. He told me later, months down the line, that he felt something released the night he drove up and found flowers on the road, and that at the funeral he had found a way to tell the priest everything. I don't know what changed for him. I only know how it looked. A man who could sleep some nights after long months. Later, when the police records and the coroner's note arrived as part of normal questions after an accident, there was nothing supernatural in them. There was salt in the paperwork and blunt language that names what died. But the people who tell me these things keep the small, stubborn sense that some things can't be explained with official forms. They keep the memory of a white dress in fog. I keep the little bracelet in a shoebox at home. I never told anyone at work how vivid it had been, because there's a truth to toll booths. They are honest places. After that night, the drivers who used to nod at me nodded a little longer. Sometimes a trucker would leave a rosary on my counter. Sometimes a woman would whisper a prayer as she paid. The road kept its rhythm. The fog returned sometimes. And somewhere beyond the light, a name that had been mistreated by the world seemed to find a small, steady space to be remembered. My name is Carlos Eduardo Mendoza Rivera. I was a night nurse on the 3rd floor of an old hospital in Guadalajara. The 3rd floor smelled like disinfectant and lemon candy. Like the kind of building that has been cleaned so many times, the cleaning smells like itself. My shift began at 11 and ended at 7. And in the middle of those hours, the floor takes on a quality of its own. Machines whisper, the air returns to the same temperature, and the patients who are awake watch the ceiling as if it hides answers. We had a patient named Elena. She was in her early 30s, soft-voiced with a small wedding band that never left her finger. She had come to us with a nightmarish fever after a car accident in the hills. She was never going to be one of those people who bounce back. They say the body is stubborn sometimes, but in her case, it was the opposite. The body was fragile, like paper in wind. I sat with her at 3 in the morning 1 week into her stay. She smiled often with eyes that were sorry for things she did not say. The hospital has a rhythm for death that staff learn not to name aloud. Sometimes you can feel the ledger tipping. The machines begin to make different sounds. The room cools. It sounds crude, but it's true. I was in Elena's room when the monitors began to go quiet. I had unplugged the television because the static was bothering her. The sullen hum of the fluorescent light above us seemed to throb with voltage. She took my hand, small, warm, and told me she wasn't afraid anymore. "Do you think they'll be okay?" she asked of no one in particular. "Who's they?" I asked. "My father." "My son," she said,
And I felt the way memory can fold in on itself. She had a child, she told me earlier, but I'd never seen a photograph. The beeps changed pitch. My training kept me moving, check the line, call the doctor, but my hands, traitor-like, shook. Not the shaking of inexperience, the human shaking. Elena reached up as if to smooth my hair and then let it fall. Afterward, in the long gray wash of morning, there were whispers in the staff room. Nurses who pull over for long stretches begin to believe in signs. Maria, an older nurse who'd been at the hospital longer than any of us, told me that nights like that, the air thickens with things that want tending. You have to speak to them, she said, not in anger, but as instruction. Sometimes they just need someone to hear. I started to watch the third floor more closely. We'd get calls from family members who said they'd seen Elena sitting by the window in the chapel, though she was still in the building. An orderly swore he'd seen her walk down the corridor in the old white uniform from the 60s, the ones that made the night seem like a different century. He said her shoes made no sound. The chapel candles would twitch, though there was no draft. Small things, but a pattern forms when small things repeat. Elena's father, Don Joaquin, came to the hospital every other day with a newspaper folded under his arm. He would sit in the plastic chair and stare at the tiled floor until the light changed. He told me once that he blamed himself for what had happened. He had driven late, he had been tired, he had not noticed a curve. I loved her, he said simply. One night he came in later than usual. He looked as if he'd walked all the way from the bus station. I can't sleep next to the bed anymore, he told me. I see her on the monitors and I hear the machines, and it is like listening to the part of her still trying. I cannot. He stopped and pressed his palms to his face. I brought him coffee and sat in the corner, listening. That night at 3, the alarms went quiet in Elena's room, but the silence that followed was not the usual absence. It felt like a folding. It felt like something moving from one room to another. Afterwards, Don Joaquin stood for a long time in the doorway. He had a look I will never forget, the face of someone who has carried a weight and then set it down, because setting it down is the only way to keep living. He put both hands on his knees and laughed, a small, incredulous sound. She looked at me, he told me later, not with the anger of someone who leaves, but the softness of someone who forgives. I told her I was sorry, and I swear, he rubbed his eyes, I swear she leaned forward like a mother and touched my cheek. Staff can be skeptical by training and credulous by exhaustion. We record vitals and chart things. We also witness the small reconciliations that don't appear in files. Don Joaquin told me he felt a hand on his shoulder that night in the chapel. He said the air smelled of jasmine, the same scent Elena always wore. He said he finally stopped asking God why and started carrying the habit of going to the cemetery not out of duty, but as a way to remember the small things he had loved. There was a nurse named Jorge who later checked the old patient registry and found a note in the margins from decades ago, an Elena or an Elena-like name with a small blessed mark next to it. The hospital had a long memory. People die here on good days and on bad days, and sometimes a young patient carrying so much unfinished life leaves some kind of echo that the rest of us feel when we stand too long in the wrong hallway. I learned then how much of our work is to keep vigil. I learned how patient the dead can be when they have something left to show the living. The thing that surprised me was not that Elena came back. It was that her return didn't frighten people into silence. It did the opposite. It opened mouths that had been shut by regret. After that month, Don Joaquin stopped staying in the chair by the bedside. He sat in the garden and spoke to anyone who would listen about the value of saying goodbye properly. The hospital kept moving. New people checked in, monitors reset. But I kept a coffee mug in the locker that had small scuffs that looked like fingerprints. I kept thinking of Elena's tiny hand in mine and how, at the end, she seemed to trust me to be there. People told me to be careful with those stories. They told me the mind can play tricks in the middle of fatigue. Maybe they are right. Maybe it was only the pause between heartbeats. But sometimes you are present in a room when forgiveness moves, and for that moment, the world becomes simpler and less cruel. My name is Felipe Mendoza. I pumped gas at a little station just off the Veracruz highway. The building smelled of kerosene, lime cleaner, and the kind of stale bread that never left a proper scent. My shifts ran from midnight until 6. The neighborhood was quiet. Houses with lights off, a stray dog that liked the warmth under the pump, a corner store that closed at 9. We had no full-time attendant because the hours were thin enough that the owner preferred to hire someone local and cheap. That someone was me. One July night, the rain came hard and sudden, drumming on the corrugated roof until the neon sign trembled. The pumps hissed. I sat on a stool, one leg over the other, radio quiet. At 2 in the morning, a car pulled up, headlights that seemed to bleed into the rain. It was an old sedan with a dented bumper. The driver didn't get out. He left the engine running. Cars come and go. That's the thing about gas stations. I went out with the umbrella, the pump nozzle extended like a handshake. There was a knock at the glass at an office door, a gentle, persistent tapping. I slid it open a crack. The woman standing there wore a white dress soaked in rain, hair stuck to her neck, bare feet on the concrete. She looked like a child who had borrowed her mother's dress. She didn't speak. She only stood there, looking through me, as if I were a pane of cheap glass. "Do you need anything?" I asked. She raised one hand and tapped the glass again. Then she turned her head toward the back lot, toward the old storage shed that had been boarded up since before I'd worked there. Something about the way she pointed made my skin crawl. We all have a western in our chest where fear rides. Mine rode up then. I stepped back and radioed the owner, who grumbled and said to call the police if anything suspicious happened. I told him I would. When I opened the door again, she was gone. No footprints in the rain, no sign of where she had walked. Later that week, someone told me that the old storage shed had once been the place where a woman, maybe young, maybe older, used to sit and wait for her lover to come. There were local stories, the kind you hear at bus stops and at wakes, of a girl who had been left to the road, of a woman who had been struck by a car on a rainy night. I was skeptical. The station sat on the artery of the highway where accidents are common. People die here. People are careless. The stories compress into nursery rhymes of grief. We started getting calls from truckers about strange things caught on trailer cameras, static, a silhouette crossing the path, lights that blinked in a pattern no one could explain. I looked at the footage on my phone late one night. A dark truck, 2 orange glows of brake lights, and then a white smear moving like smoke across the frame. The resolution was bad. The trucker swore what he saw was a woman crossing the lot to the shed, but the picture looked like rain and interference. A week later, a local woman, the owner of the corner store who cleaned my pumps with a broom every morning, told me not to open the door to anyone who knocks after midnight. Some things wear the shape of a woman to get in, she said, and she did not smile. Her voice was quiet and old, as if she had learned to speak with the care of someone who had survived more than her share of small dangers. One night at 3 in the morning, someone knocked again. It was a soft knocking, patient. I looked through the glass. A girl in white stood there. My heart jumped so hard I thought it might stop. She didn't speak. I could see the rain on her shoulders. She tapped once, and this time the sound traveled right through me. I remembered the corner store owner's words. I remembered how the trucker's footage had smeared because something in the air didn't want to be recorded. I thought of the tender mouths of children who lose their lives, and how they sometimes appear to those who work nights. I closed the door and locked it, and for a long time after that, I sat on the stool, watching the rain, the neon, the glow of the pumps. I left a candle on the counter the next morning, because candles, whether they help or not, feel like something solemn to offer. The owner fired me 2 months later, for reasons that had nothing to do with ghosts. The station is still there. People still stop. Sometimes truckers leave rosaries by the pumps. Sometimes I drive past and see lights in the storage shed, like someone has put a lamp there for a long night's work. I don't know whether what I saw wanted to be let in or was warning me not to open the door. The caution lives with me. Do not open the door to shadows that sound like rain. The night teaches you small rules that don't make sense until the morning. Across these stories runs a thread. The night narrows life down to the essentials, and in that thinness, people meet more than routine. Duty pushes them forward, grief pulls, and sometimes what remains is a simple human thing. Someone asking to be seen, someone trying to forgive, someone knocking at a glass door. There are other voices that came to me as I asked questions. A trucker named Jorge remembered the Toluca bypass like a map in his head. He said he saw white dresses out on the road sometimes, and that the lights themselves seemed to behave different on those stretches, as if the road is deciding what to show you. An old woman in Guadalajara, who once ran the hospital chapel, told me to put flowers in a jar and leave them by the place where a life was remembered. If you don't do it, she said, they will come back to ask you why. These are small testimonies, the kind we trade in the soft hours when the world is quiet and confession feels safe. I went through records as much as a person like me can. I read the short notices in the local papers, the obituaries with their careful arabesques, the police blotters with their sober lines. The names appear: Andrea Morales, Elena Rodriguez, others whose lives were cataloged in the dry ledger of events. There are no grand explanations in those pages, only facts, dates, and sometimes a plea for someone to check a mailbox or a car. Between those lines, you can sense families shaken, people who will not sleep the same way again. And between those names and the warm, living people in front of me, Don Emilio, Don Joaquin, the corner store owner, there is a network of small actions that congeal into something like care. Not all the stories are tidy. Not all doors close. Some nights the knock comes and you lock it, and the feeling of being watched stays. Some losses have no ceremony. The unresolved stories settle like a weight you put under your shirt and learn to carry in silence. In the station lot, in the booth, on the third floor, there are moments when the rules of day do not apply, and the living must decide how to act in front of the unknown. If there's a lesson, I can't say it's one I've learned intentionally. Maybe it's that duty matters, to check a stopped car, to hold a hand through a beep, to choose not to open a door when the knock sounds wrong. Maybe it's that forgiveness moves faster than paperwork. Maybe it's that the night wants us to pay attention. I do know this: the names stay with you. The faces visit your sleep. You find yourself setting little things aside in a box, offering a quiet memory. You meet the living who carry those memories, and sometimes they tell you simply, "I forgave him," or "She touched my cheek," and it feels like something has been returned. There are other nights. There are other voices I gathered. Shift supervisors who recorded odd CCTV anomalies that look like static and not much else. Bus drivers who swear they gave a lift to no one, and a child who, when asked about the woman in white, drew only a door and a road. I still carry the bracelet. I still keep the mug with the scuffs. I still go home on nights when the fog is thin and think about how fragile our lights are. If these stories did anything for you, if you felt a chill or a nudge of recognition, tell us below where you're watching from and whether night ever felt different to you after you read this. There are more that I have not told, the ones that don't fit neatly into a confession or an obituary, but they're small and perhaps they'll keep. For now, leave your lights on a little longer, double lock the doors you mean to keep closed, and be kind to the people you meet in the small hours. The night remembers who you are. The woman who ran the morning shift at the municipal cemetery answered the phone with the tired politeness of someone who has learned to live with ghosts in a professional way. Her name was Mariella.
She had the habit of humming to herself while she watered the grave, she told me. And once, years ago, she swore she heard someone hum back in a voice that wasn't quite a voice. She laughed when she told it, the kind of laugh that keeps the story from lodging like a stone. I leave a candle sometimes, she said, in the new section where we put the names that people don't come for. It settles things. Not always, but it is something. I went to the new section. It was farther than the older rows, a square of dirt and names half erased by weather. The candlelight made the inscriptions look like faces. There were no grand markers here. Small plaques, a scattering of plastic flowers, one ceramic cat someone had placed as if the dead person were an old pet. I left a small bouquet in a jar on the advice of the woman from Guadalajara, though there was no ceremony, only the quiet pressing of plastic stems and the slight crinkle of newspaper tied around them. The act felt like an offering both to the absent and to the part of me that wanted to close the ledger of wonderment. At the station, I sat with the late shift officers. Officer Castillo, who had the kind of jaw that suggested sleep came as a decision rather than a blessing, showed me a clip they had saved on a hard drive, a short black and white shot from a camera mounted above the west gate. The image jittered like a photograph exposed to a tremor and then steadied. For 10 seconds, the gate sat empty. Then static, the kind that splinters images. In the static, a shape slid through as though someone had walked through fog. You could not make it out. It was less a person than the idea of someone. The feed returned to normal afterward, and that was all. No footprints, no opened gate, no report of an intrusion. They call it interference, Castillo said, signal drop. But the feed was fine before and after. For that 10 seconds, nobody in the lot, nobody on duty by the gate. Then there were tracks, not fresh, older, like someone had dragged their feet in the mud long ago. He had a way of shrugging his hands that made the unsaid heavy. We don't put it in the report unless someone files a complaint. It's not our job to believe, it's our job to write. Belief, I learned over the months, must be earned by repetition or by the stubbornness of a private memory. Patterns accrued not in a single tale, but in the meeting of many small anomalies. A trucker who said the road rearranged itself. A child who drew a door. An old woman who insisted on flowers. A security camera that refused to render a human despite creating traces like memory. It formed a lattice of things that could not be reduced to accident. I took the Toluca bypass one night because Jorge had been emphatic about driving it at 3 in the morning when the lights are honest and the air presses its coldness like a hand. The bypass sits outside town on a strip where the light bulbs are spaced with the thrift of someone managing expense. The road was a ribbon of reflectors. Trucks moved like slow insects. I drove slowly, the heater keeping the glass fogged at the edges. My headlights carved a tunnel. The world beyond remained soft and anonymous. At the halfway point, there was a place where the road bent and opened to a sparse stand of mesquite. Jorge had told me the white dresses like to appear where the guardrails hold each other's hands. I parked on the shoulder and sat with the engine ticking as it cooled. The night had a quality of being on a hinge. Everything was held and could be let go. I remembered the caution, do not open the door to shadows that sound like rain. It moved through me like a proverb. A woman walked out of the black at the far edge of my headlights. She was not on the road so much as in its memory. She wore something white, a garment that caught no detail and held a softness that suggested lace though there was none. She moved not like a pedestrian, but like an after-image, one foot tracing the other as if following a path already made. I did not move. The car remained between me and her like a polite barrier. She stopped, turned, and for a moment the lights caught the line of her cheekbone. She was very young. She raised an arm as if to ask permission to pass. The breath at the back of my throat said the rules. Do not open the door when the knock sounds wrong. I watched her until she dissolved into the mesquite. She laughed at the memory.
And for a moment the house was full of the sound of a life that did not agree to be erased. "We made a jar," Lucia told me. "Just a few flowers and water. You would think such things are for the dead to remember themselves, but really they are for the ones who stay. It tells the living how to keep a place as if someone might come back." I began to think of jars as instruments of order. They were a way to localize grief. Put flowers by a place, and you make a contract with memory. If the inhabitants of this town were on one side of the ledger, then rituals, however small, were the practical arithmetic of dealing with loss. Not everyone wanted to talk. Some people sat like closed books, all pages glued together by a decision to keep certain nights unread. A man who worked the late shift at the corner gas station had the hands of someone who woke up early and mended things. He did not speak of apparitions, but when I mentioned static on cameras, he remembered a night the pumps had recorded a customer who did not pay, who reached for the nozzle and left without filling the tank. "We thought someone had messed with the system," he said. Then, the next day, the cement by pump 3 had scabs of dried flower petals. People come and leave odd things sometimes. What interested me was less the thing itself than the way people compartmentalized it. The town had a grammar for the inexplicable. A jar here, a candle there, a shrug, and a recorded note at the station. Even the most resolutely secular laid down rules like prayers. The rules held the town together and made the night survivable. A cleric from the cathedral, Father Octavio, invited me to a late-night prayer meeting he held once a month for relatives who had not found rest. The church smelled of beeswax and old books. The congregation was small, a handful of women and a man who kept his head bowed as if avoiding the burden of consciousness. They held candles and names and spoke in low voices. The priest read old psalms that sounded like maps, a plea, a promise, an ordering of sorrow. "When people do not get a funeral," Father Octavio said later, leaning on the ledge of the altar, "the place where they should be tends to leak. A person is not only their body, they are the pattern of things, where they sit, what they leave on the table. If the pattern is broken, then the world must try to mend itself in other ways. Sometimes it is a memory, sometimes a voice, sometimes a path. We do what we can. We pray, we leave a light, and we remind one another to look out for each other." It is easy to be cynical in the face of such language. It is easier still to compartmentalize grief as superstition. But there is something practical in the prayer. It focuses attention. It establishes caretakers. It summons a community to a small task of keeping vigil. In a town where the night narrows everything, the act of noticing is a kind of defense. Noticing is what keeps someone from slipping entirely into the ledger of events. The night I sat with the television cameras and the jarred flowers, I began to notice a pattern in the objects left behind. A bracelet, a mug, a kettle, objects that orbit daily life. They are the kinds of things that can be misplaced and then found, but when discovered under strange circumstances, they become tokens. They were not grand relics, they were small and domestic, which is perhaps why they had power. They carried the intimacy of routines, and when returned or retrieved, they returned a measure of the ordinary to a place unsettled. There came a night when that smallness pushed through into a kind of insistence. I was on my way to interview a bus driver who claimed he had given a lift to no one, but then realized someone had been sitting in the seat beside him when he checked the mirror. It was raining, a steady, thin rain that made the light smear into halos. I took shelter in a coffee shop under a sign that offered anemic coffee and warmer conversation. The radio above the counter played a program of late-night callers sharing confessions. An old woman sat in the corner, wrapped in a shawl that had seen better winters. She had a face like a map, lines that ran in long stories. She met my eyes and spoke without preface. "They come because we forget to say their names," she said. "If you forget a person and do not say their name aloud, they have nothing to hold on to. So they look for you. They try to find a tongue that will make them real again."
She folded her hands as if gripping something thin and precise. When my nephew died, he had a hat. We left the hat on his chair because he always put it there. He was gone, and the chair sat as if waiting. The hat tumbled down one night and landed by the door. I don't think it moved on its own. I think someone put it there to remind us. Maybe it was my nephew, maybe it was the night, but it made us look. There are acts that return the living to their task. The small things people do, leave a candle, water a grave, place flowers in a jar, are not always to placate the absent. Sometimes they are to remind the living to keep their side of the world organized. Rituals are engines that generate attention. They are obligations that press memory into daily habits so that grief does not slip into the cracks and make the house hollow. I started to keep a small notebook where I recorded not only the stories but the items: kettle, bracelet, mug, hat. I numbered them like small inventory. It felt ridiculous at first, an archivist of incidentals, but the inventory helped me see where the pattern tightened. Each object had a home in someone's routine. Each object, when displaced, left a vacancy that demanded attention. That vacancy sometimes expressed itself as a knock, a shadow, a static in a camera. The night translated lack into presence in ways I could not always account for. There was one story, told to me by an EMT named Rosa, that lodged deeper than the rest. She had been to calls in which the ambulance crew found a home empty of a person who had been expected the night before. The family swore the person had gone to bed and did not wake. But in several cases, the family later reported small gestures: an extra teacup put out as if for someone who was always late to dinner, or a handkerchief folded more neatly than usual. "It's like the house tries to remember for you," Rosa said. "It puts things right. Sometimes it is very small. Sometimes it is a terrible thing. But we keep our eyes open because we owe them that." She told me about a case where a man had vanished and returned days later without explanation, sitting again at his table as if nothing had happened. He had lost time, he said later, but some mornings he could speak of the smell of rain and a door he had not opened. The physical details were thin and the testimony inconsistent, but the affect, how people rearrange their lives, was consistent. The night presses on the living, and the way they respond becomes a kind of script for the rest. Once, near dawn, I received a call from Don Joaquin. He had found something by the back gate of his house, a child's shoe, single and scuffed, with a smear of red on the sole that could have been paint or rust. He had placed it on the stoop like an offering and left it there. "It is a sign," he told me, "not a message, just a sign. You must do what you do with signs." The language of the town preserves a distinction between message and sign. Signs are cannot derive claims that point without explaining. Messages demand deciphering. I went to the gate and photographed the shoe. There was no explanation. The neighbors offered theories. Someone lost a shoe while fleeing a dog, a child playing games, a prank. None fit. The shoe had the quality of an idiom. It seemed to mean pay attention without saying why. When I walked back to the house, the neighbor's dog followed me and settled under the streetlight as if keeping a vigil. The dog blinked with the slow comprehension of an animal who knows when something is out of order but cannot speak of it. I left thinking of the jars and candles and kettles. The town was a knot of small services. There would be a time in the weeks to come when all these threads would tangentially meet: camera, jar, locket, bypass, shoe. I could feel the shape of something larger forming in the ledger of nights, but the ledger does not reveal its final line all at once. It reveals margins and arrows and marginalia that suggest a direction. For now, the town continued its small acts of keeping. Someone would set out a jar, someone would hum a hymn in the cemetery, someone would set a kettle on the stove and leave the flame low. These are small faiths, pragmatic and tender. They keep the night honest. At dusk the next evening, the radio in my car announced a minor accident on the bypass. 2 vehicles, a minor pileup.
No fatalities. The reporter's voice moved through the static like an instruction. I felt the old animal in me, curiosity that wore the face of investigation, tighten. I drove toward the slight glow of emergency lights, aware that the road could reassert itself as a place where the town's rules are tested. As I turned onto the bypass, the spill of brake lights painted the guardrails with fat red strokes. The police had blocked a section. A tow truck rattled like a great insect. On the shoulder, an old man in a wool cap stood and watched the scene as if watching a slow theater of accidents. He did not belong to the crews nor to the drivers who argued. He was simply there. He met my eyes and raised a hand in something like greeting. "You see him?" he asked. "What?" I said, because the question was both too large and too private. He pointed toward the dark embankment. For a moment, I saw only the silhouette of Mesquite against the wet night. Then, beyond the trees, a strip of white like a fold in the landscape, as if someone had left fabric draped over an unseen chair. "Sometimes they come to the accident," the man said. "They look from a distance. They do not touch. They wait like they remember being part of the world that made machines hum." He let out a breath that fogged his lips. "They do not mean harm. They only stand as if asking to be noticed." I had the feeling then that the town itself was a machine that needed noticing. Its gears were jars and candles and folded towels. To look was a form of maintenance. The old man looked back toward the embankment and then away. "We keep our lights on," he said, "not because we fear what is there, but because we hope to see something else. Someone's face, a hat, a name, a thing to make sense." I walked the line between the emergency lights and the guardrail until the wet fabric had the human quality of a sleeve. The town's small inventory had grown heavier with another item. The sighting at an accident. A woman at the edge of a crash scene, like someone waiting for permission to pass. I took a picture with my phone. Nothing came through but a smear of white softened like cotton. The camera, I decided, was a poor witness for things that want to be half-truths. I left the bypass feeling as if I had stepped through a seam. The notes in my notebook multiplied. Kettle, bracelet, shoe, white dress at an accident. Patterns are drawn by repetition, and repetition makes the odd into the credible. Still, credibility is a function of how people choose to live with what they can't explain. When I went home that night, I stood by my door long enough to lock it twice. The town hummed faintly around me. The distant beeping of a traffic light, the dog that barked 3 streets away. I left the porch light on because the woman with the kettle had taught me that small things can be anchors. Inside, the mug with the scuffs sat on my table, a domestic relic I had kept because it felt like a talisman against making of the night a fiction. I poured coffee, the noise of the liquid against ceramic, ordinary and defiant at once. There are rules in the night, and you learn them by living. Some are practical. Lock the door, check the registry, record the camera. Some are softer, passed on in the tone of a neighbor. Leave a jar, say a name, keep a light burning. They are not remedies for grief so much as compasses that keep you from wandering into the river where memory can be lost. And yet, even with rules, you remain vulnerable to the way memory calls. That vulnerability is part of being human, the readiness to answer a knocking you cannot always justify. As I sat, coffee cooling, I thought of all the small things in my notebook, and how, together, they made a map that led to questions. Maps are only useful when you decide to follow them. I had one now, and it ran across the town in thin ink. Outside, the night moved like water. Inside, the kettle sat on the stove like a promise that someone had already made. I hoped the next day would bring more names, more jars, more witnesses. I hoped it would bring something that bent the shape of the ledger into a clearer line. Perhaps it would, perhaps it would not. The night, as it often did, left me with only what I could do. Keep watching, keep cataloging,
keep taking the small, necessary actions that make the living part of the world bearable. It was then, at the edge of wakefulness and ritual, that the phone vibrated on the table. The screen showed a volunteer at the cemetery. He sent one word and a photo. The photo was of a jar. Inside the jar, a single white petal drifted on water like a small, perfect moon.